Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started. Good afternoon, good morning. I don't even know what time it is. Welcome back to the Rewind.
Whatever time it is, it's not the time people are going to listen.
That's true, so it doesn't matter. Good morning, good evening.
We're filming
happy day.
11:15 on Tuesday morning.
Yeah, so that's right. When other people need to listen to it. 11:15 the next day.
That's right.
That way it feels like it's the same time of day. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Perfect.
Listen whenever you need to. Just know I got confused already. My name is Rachel. I'm your host today. Blair is on vacation, so I'll be filling in for the next couple of weeks.
We should say something so that we make sure and check and see if Blair is actually listening.
Ooh, like a code word.
Yeah.
We'll drop a code word.
Code
later.
word kale.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I feel like Blair would bring up kale just in regular conversation, though. So I'm not sure if that's a very good code word.
No, code word Snickers.
Snickers. There you go.
That's good. Snickers it is. Yeah. Blair, if you're listening, report back.
Yep.
With me today is Derek. He was preaching in Cambridge, and Darryl, you were in Kitchener. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Super excited to be here. We are finished the second last week of
the
Exodus.
Penultimate message in Exodus.
Was it?
Yep.
All right.
Penultimate is the second to last.
I didn't know that, so here we go. Learning everything. Something new. It's kind of sad, but we'll reflect on the end of Exodus later on today. We're not going to jump ahead to the end. So, what I was wondering before we get started, Darryl opened up his message in Kitchener with this idea of loving the idea of something, but hating doing it. So I want to know what something is that you both love the idea of, but hate doing in when it comes to push comes to shove. What do you love? Darryl, I'll give you a freebie you can share because our Cambridge listeners may not have heard your sermon, so they might not know what you shared. So
sure, I'll share the same one. So on Sunday I shared about how I loved the idea of reading classic books like A Tale of Two Cities, Pride and Prejudice, like the Iliad, like all these like classic old novels, and love the idea. I wish I could say I'm a super well-read guy in those areas, but actually I just find it a slog. Like it's so hard to actually get through these books, and I more enjoy books that are written in this century. The way I always put it, like if you can't directly adapt the novel to a movie, I probably am gonna struggle with reading it. So yeah. So ultimately, I end up probably just watching the movie version.
All right.
Yeah.
And you finished none of the classics then?
I've finished some. It's been a struggle, for sure. And I always refer back to it do you guys remember the old TV show Wishbone?
Yes.
Do you guys remember that?
Nope.
No? Do you know what have you heard of it?
What's the story, Wishbone?
No? All right. So Wishbone is this TV show from like a few decades ago where there's this dog that acts out like all these like classic novels and
was this a kid's show? Maybe it was just before my time.
It was a kid's show.
It's definitely a kid's
show.
show.
Or just after my time, I mean.
Yeah, after. Yeah. I also watched it growing up, but Darryl and I
you guys are a
little
little younger than me, so I missed out on Wishbone.
Yeah, so it's a lot of people in our generation, that's the thing that they refer back to, and that's where like you don't even have to read these books. You just kind of in a tight 20 minutes just explain the whole plot to all these old stories
with the dog.
With the dog that no one in the show ever acknowledged that he wasn't a human. Just that they were just talking to this dog. It's such a bizarre premise for a TV show. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was the 90s that something like that could not just be on the air, but could put out a solid like 5 or 6 seasons. Like it went on for way longer than it should have.
Yeah.
Kind of like this discussion.
Yes. Yeah. So let's move on. Hey, thank you for sharing that with us, Darryl. Derek, what about you? What is something you love the idea of but hate doing?
Yeah, probably eating healthy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we discussed off air, you have not seen that through.
Well, I have. No, I have, because what is a diet but eating healthy? But then it ends, right? Ends. Yeah. And I'm always super grateful when that comes to it. I think it's the moment I first pack a salad for lunch that I'm like, I don't like this enough.
Have you ever?
I love the idea, but
yeah,
I don't like living it out.
I'm curious. Have you ever done like one of those like fad diets of like just like doing like keto or like one of those more extreme carnivore diets?
Amanda tried to get me to do something. I can't really remember. It was like cutting out all processed sugars and stuff. It lasted for me like 8 days.
It's still pretty good.
I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah.
She went like the full 40 or whatever.
Wow.
Oh, was it like the whole 30 or something?
I don't know, something like that.
Daniel diet. You can take that out of.
And there was too much work of figuring out like, okay, you can have nuts and fruits on these days, but not this day. I don't understand.
It's hard.
I already talked, Rachel, I talked on Sunday. Spreadsheets and I, like, that's not really my thing. If I got to spreadsheet my lunches and suppers, that's not good.
No. There are people here who may love that though.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
If you want to spreadsheet Derek's lunches.
Yeah, if you want to do the work for me, I'll give it a try if you think you've got a plan for me.
I do have to admit, I do enjoy being really organized in some areas of my life. And so when I open up a new spreadsheet, like that's pretty exciting. It's like getting like really into the details. Yeah, so I can really nerd out on some of those fine details.
Right.
For those of you who are listening, you did not see my face or Derek's face. Neither him or I share in that joy or excitement.
Yeah.
With that though, Darryl started his sermon off with that topic and tied it into generosity. And so oftentimes we love the idea of being generous, but when push comes to shove, maybe we're not as great as making that practically happen. I would love for both of you to just give a quick outline of where you took this sermon. It was titled Generous Hands and Hearts. You both ended up with 7 points of generosity, which...
the number of perfection, Rachel.
The number of perfection. It was whole and complete. And so for all of our women who have walked through the Jen Wilkins studies, she highlighted that often. So, it is true. So 7 principles, you both had them. Derek, you want to start off?
Sure. Yeah. So the big idea was that God's plan is accomplished by people whose hearts have been stirred to give of their time, talents, and treasures to his purposes. So, we just looked at some different truths about giving as we go through this passage. What do we see? Because I think this passage is really pattern setting, paradigmatic for the people of God and how we ought to enter into and experience giving.
Thank you. And Darryl, want to give a quick recap?
Yeah. So the main point I wanted to push on this week is the fact that God is not after your stuff, but he is after your heart. And that really, I want to make sure that was the emphasis, because I think so often when we talk about generosity, so often it's focused in on giving of our time, talents, resources, of just, that is the emphasis of just giving those things. But I want to make sure that we go a little bit deeper beyond that the God who created everything in the entire universe just by speaking a word, does he truly need those things? I think that going a little bit deeper into it, that he's trying to do something in us. He's forming and shaping us into his image through this process of generosity. And so that's where God is really just pursuing, where's our heart at? Are we after just accumulating these things for ourselves, or are we willing to trust in him and to be generous with what God has given to us. And so came up with 7 principles. Derik and I were talking earlier in the week, and he mentioned the 7 principles. And I would like to say, I consider this collaboration. But as I was sitting down writing, I'm like, that 7 was just in my mind. I'm like, all right, I think I can come up with 7. So
he's got 7. I can get 7.
I'm pretty sure there's 7 in here. There's more than 7. I came up with 8, but I brought it back to 7 just to be the same. And I'm really curious. I haven't checked yet if any of them match up. You can tell us today if any of them actually match up with each other.
Now you use different words, but they were pretty close in really the true heart of what you both were trying to get at. They were very similar in that. So you were both pretty bang on, but also because you use the same text. So obviously you did your homework. So when we talk about generosity and we talk about it being God's will and He is inviting us into these things, I hope it wasn't lost on everyone if you've been tracking with this series all the way through Exodus. It just seems that it's building one week after the other, and I think obviously God designed it that way. But so last week we talked about understanding the grace and holiness of God, and without that understanding, you guys both talked about it this week, it's really hard to give out of what you have in a generous spirit without that understanding of grace. So we kind of see that really big picture. I wonder if you guys can kind of tie it together nicer than I'm explaining, but the big picture of where we see where the Israelites have gone to where they are now and how we apply that to our lives today. It's just not a nice story where we read about what when we study and read through the Bible, we should be moving it from just knowledge and into practical implications or applications into our own lives. So do you want to talk about that, Derik?
Yeah, I started the message by kind of giving us a big picture recap of Exodus. And I know Darryl's shared this quote before from Jen Welcome. I think it's just such a good summary of the book of Exodus, that the first part is God taking the people out of Egypt, and the second part is God taking Egypt out of the people. And this is part of that. Interestingly, I've heard, I don't remember where I first heard it. I know a lot of people have said it. In the journey of discipleship, oftentimes the last thing that is discipled in a people is their wallet. And it's because generosity, as Darryl and I both talked about, is really an overflow of the heart, right? Yeah. So these are tangible actions coming out of what God is already doing in our heart. It's coming out of an experience. So the experience for God's people, Israel as God's people, was that God had just shown them an incredible amount of grace after falling into idolatry while Moses was up on the mountain, and not just wiping them out. And when we experience grace, it does something to us, right? If we truly experience, we truly understand God's grace, it affects us, it changes us. And then when we truly experience how glorious God is, it affects us and it changes us, and it works its way out in practical ways. And one of the practical ways that it works itself out is that it develops in us first a heart of gratitude, that we are thankful and we recognize these are things that we have received from God. And then gratitude always shows itself through generosity, through understanding, wow, like this isn't mine that I've earned. This has come to me from God, so I can give it away because God provides.
Yeah. And I think that's a hard lesson to learn when you don't actually sit down and think about it. When you get caught in the everyday coming and going of life and you don't actually pause, it's really hard to see these things.
Well, and I think generosity, one of the things that it forces us into when we discipline ourselves to generosity is it reshapes our, it's like sometimes the generosity comes first. Yeah. Sometimes we give, and in giving, it changes our heart to greater trust in what God has done for us, because we're forced to release what we may be putting our trust in oftentimes, which is our stuff.
Right. Yeah. and that kind of counters to the point, it's the same thing, but Darryl focused in on, at one point, that scarcity mindset. So we can either already live in giving out of abundance or generosity, but also on the flip side, I think some people live in this scarcity mindset. Do you want to talk about what that looks like and how perhaps you break that cycle of, wanting to hold on to your things because I think you talked about Christmas and gift giving.
Yeah.
Was your point here. So you want to talk about that a little bit more, kind of counters to the other side of it.
Yeah, I think that at some degree that we all battle with a scarcity mindset, or some might call it a poverty mindset. Just looking at what we have, our resources that are available to us, and just recognizing like, hey, that is limited. And so to greater or lesser degrees, we're all going to have to battle with this idea of a scarcity mindset of, if I give too much, am I going to be able to achieve all the goals that I have in my mind? Am I willing to give up? Like, what if the economy tanks the next day? What if the inflation continues to get out of control? And you might, during this season right now, feel the need to hold on just a little bit tighter onto the resources that you have. And the thing that can even hit this, and Craig Rochelle talks about this in a few of his different books. He's talked about the idea of a scarcity mindset. And for him, it was actually because of his past, because of his family. He talked about how his grandparents lived through the Great Depression, and they shared with him stories of what happens when the stock market crashes. And so his entire life, he lived with this scarcity mindset, always kind of afraid to give too much. And shared stories of like accidentally giving away a gift card that had no money on it because he refused to throw away empty gift cards, and that kind of came back to bite him. And so God had to teach him how to overcome this. And a big part of that is how do we trust God with what we have? And I think that is something that we all are going to have to wrestle through and learn. How do we trust God, not just with our salvation? I think often we talk about that, but really with our everyday life. How do we trust and know that God is going to provide and take care of us? And I think that generosity is a way that we can actually explore that trust, how we can actually build those trust muscles inside of us, recognizing like, hey, I can be generous in the church and with those around me. I can be generous with my time, with my family. The more that you are generous, I think the more that you can recognize, okay, God's going to provide and take care of me as I'm practicing this.
And that's the reminder, I think, Derek, point number 5, everything we have has already come from God first.
Yeah.
It's not ours. It was never ours to begin with. So give it back to God, that open-handed living.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in the text. We see that the stuff that they had came from God compelling the Egyptians to give to them as they were leaving the land. This is about a year out now. Mm-hmm. So a year ago, they got all of this stuff given to them that was exactly what God was going to need later on for the building of his tabernacle. But we also see in the text that God gives the skill. Mm-hmm. I love, it says that God put into the mind of the craftsman the skill that was required. And oftentimes we don't, I think even as Christians, sometimes it's okay. Like ultimately the stuff I have comes from God, but do we understand that the abilities that we have come from God? Amanda and I got into this discussion around spiritual gifts and natural abilities. And at some level, at a basic level, it doesn't really matter what is a natural ability and what is a spiritual gift. All of it has come from God. It may have come from God in your DNA, or it may come from God through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit later, but all of it has been given to you by God. You don't get to claim credit for that. I mean, I don't know how you claim credit for DNA in the first place. I guess if you were like Michael J. Fox going back in time and helping to make sure your parents get together, I guess maybe.
I'll just put it this way. Anyone who's like really proud of their DNA, like it never comes off never comes off good. It usually reflects poorly on the person, typically.
Yeah, and that doesn't even get into the reality that, sometimes you just get this opportunity or a lucky break, right? Yeah. Almost anytime you read a story of somebody who has been incredibly successful, there has been an opportunity, someone who stepped in their life, or just their skills align with the right moment in history that allows that to take place. Well, that's God superintending all of those things in the first place.
Yeah. I think they actually call that the Founder Fallacy, where you think that someone just purely by sheer ability is able to do something like build a company like Amazon.
Yep.
It's all one person. That's kind of not true. There's people around them, and even beyond that, like God is orchestrating what's happening throughout history. So, yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's that the necessity of needing to pause and recognize and just take time to think about it. So I wonder, as you talk about these things, and perhaps the listeners have done it or not done it, but it would be a great time to sit and take an audit of the time and how you spend your time and your money and your talents, and where do you give first and who gets the most of your time. I did this with some of the young adults a little bit ago and asked them to kind of track where they're spending their time. And we didn't go into finances because I wasn't talking about that, but it gives you something to look at, tangible, and marks where you're actually using those things or spending your money or doing that. So I'm encouraging you, do a time audit, see how you're using those gifts and recognize that they have been given to you by God for a purpose. And participation in our generosity, it's a gift from God. It's a get to, it's not a have to. So what does it look like maybe to put this into practice? We've all been given different talents. Derek, you just kind of talked about that. Gifts from God, skills and abilities. How do we put those into practice in a way that is honoring instead of just kind of like, oh yeah, I kind of do that. I don't want to brush it off as something we do, but how do we, put it into action?
Yeah, I think starting with just thinking about what you have to offer. You talked about a time audit. I think it's helpful to do kind of a talent audit as well. What skills and abilities do you have? We often think that some of the skills and abilities we have, well, what's God going to do with those? I think probably if you were a person who didn't have a bunch of gold, silver, and bronze, but you had a bunch of goats, you probably thought, well, what's God going to do with my goats? God asked for goat hair to make the tabernacle, right? I think sometimes we think there's just certain gifts and skills that can be used by God. So if you can sing really well, play an instrument, maybe you can speak or teach, maybe you're really friendly or you like kids, and not everybody has any of those things, right? But I think God can use every ability. And I tried to, on Sunday, start to plant some of those thoughts into people's heads. And I was amazed by already how many people have come back and said, oh man, I hadn't even thought about, just had somebody email me yesterday about the ability to speak another language and say that God started to impress on their heart. Is there a way that I could use this to be a blessing to other people and draw people towards Jesus? And they got thinking about doing some language training for people who were interested in missions, but also just teaching English or teaching Spanish as a second language to kids and starting to build some relationships there with individuals and families who would like to grow in that. And I think we just need to look and be willing to offer up all of what we have and say, God, through your Holy Spirit, would you spur me to think about how I could use this for your glory and to draw people towards Christ?
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. We often hear people want more programs or want to connect in different ways. And I wonder if they just paused for a second and said, hey, maybe I could be the one who runs this. Or so maybe if there is a gap that you're feeling, perhaps, it's you. the church is waiting for you to step into those roles. And
absolutely. Yeah. I just had someone who emailed me the other day of asking about a ministry that we don't have. And the conversation from there switches to like, well, maybe this is the start of something. That's often how these things get off the ground, is because someone has a gifting and a passion for something in the church. And that's usually how it gets started.
And you might need a spreadsheet person around you to help to organize those things, right? And the spreadsheet person is sitting there thinking, well, what am I ever going to do with my gifts of just organization? Can God? Absolutely. Like, this is what I love about the pictures that Paul paints in the New Testament about church life and the body, that you've got all of these different parts, and some of them may not be as prominent, but they're all as important. And if they're not all playing a role, then the body is limping or disabled in some way, right? But when every part is coming together as God has designed it, then we reflect Jesus. We become the body of Christ that fully reflects Christ's glory to the world.
Yeah. And I think that like an important thing to emphasize in this part of the conversation is when we talk about giving of your time, talents, resources, of not thinking through like, just, am I the best at something? Like with your ability, your spiritual gifting might not mean that you are the absolute best at, I'll just say, worship ministry. You might not be like the absolute best at playing the keyboard, but maybe, like you still have the gifting, the ability to jump in on that, or hospitality. You might not say, well, I'm not like the friendliest person, but try not to think in terms of gifting means that you are in the top 1% of that category. It just might mean that you have just a leaning and a bent towards that. And I think that so often that's the thing that holds us up from truly being generous, of thinking, well, I can only give so much. And I know the person beside me can give 10 times as much. So I'm just going to hold back because I know it just pales in comparison. But I think that the call to generosity, again, it goes back to that discipleship aspect that we're talking about, that it's not that you're the absolute best, but God wants you to use what you have to continue to be formed and shaped into the person that he is forming you into. And so that, I think that really ends up changing the conversation. On the resource side of thing, I just want to mention a podcast real quickly, artrainer.com, if you want to go there. I'll see if Billy can add that to the show notes. But if you're looking for like another podcast to fill your week, because this one unfortunately comes to an end eventually, I really appreciate what he has to share about generosity, and he includes that in his teaching on how to budget, how to use your resources, and he puts that as like a pretty big aspect of when you're planning finances, just budgeting for your week, for your month and year, of including generosity in that. So if you would find it helpful, artrainer.com, I've found his resource pretty helpful over time.
Yeah, that's great. And generosity is not just finances. Again, we kind of have talked about this timing, and Derek, you landed, your last point was, when the hearts of God's people have been stirred by his glory and the grace, there'll be more than enough. And so in Exodus, where we were reading, we didn't even reference it. We were in 35 and 36 this week.
Yep.
They saw an abundance of giving. They had more than enough stuff. And at that point in your sermon, you talked about, what happens when we have more. And that is the hope of a pastor, and the hope of the church is that at one point we're going to get to the spot where we're like, okay, pause. We've got so much. We don't even know what to do with it.
Rachel's got so many table leaders for women's ministry that like she doesn't have enough people to put at the tables.
I'm not there. There's
wouldn't
always,
that be awesome?
That would be so great. And then I wonder, well, what room can we move into next?
Right.
We're going to take over the
It's
auditorium.
not that we're going to stop, because this is the thing. Whereas the Tabernacle is kind of Amanda and I had this conversation, because the Tabernacle is a defined kind of project, right? Yeah. But the mission that we've been given to make disciples, it is kind of unlimited. Yeah. So, man, I would love it if we just had so many people. We said, okay, we're going to put a pause on this for a second, and we're going to figure out how to multiply out. Like, do we need to go plant a church someplace else in the city? Maybe God is calling some of you overseas into cross-cultural ministry. I don't know what it is, but it's not that those resources would go to waste. It's that we have to sit down and say, man, what is God calling us to now? Because he's provided all of this.
Yeah. And to me, that's so exciting. I'd like just to watch that, to watch people understand what God is doing and he's up to something. And then to want to be like, I want to be part of this story. I think all of us can sit here and say, we don't want you just to be Sunday attendees. We want this to overflow into your life. This is the discipleship idea, that it's not just Sundays, and it just kind of penetrates into everywhere. And that's the abundance that they're giving out of. Yeah. So how are we doing that? What does that look like? How do you invest in a way, meaningful ways, giving yourself first to God, and then out of that?
Well, I think that giving yourself first to God is the key, right? That, if it's just compulsion, if it's strictly even discipline or white knuckling, I'm not saying there's not any disciplining ourselves to this. We've talked about the fact that like generosity is a gift some people have, so it's easier for some. Service is a gift some people have. Some of us have to discipline ourselves to it a little bit more. But ultimately what you see here is people whose hearts have been transformed. And that's what Darryl was saying in his main point here, is our hearts have to be captured by how glorious and how good and how gracious God is. And then this becomes a no-brainer response, right? We don't have to work it up. It flows out of us. So if you're struggling with generosity, it might be because you're not spending enough time looking into the face of God, that you're not actually overwhelmed with how good he has been to you. Your heart isn't actually full of gratitude for all the things. So you may have to first develop a discipline of gratitude in your life, where when good things happen, when even those little moments in a day, like you see, the beauty of creation, that you stop and say thanks, you discipline yourself to gratitude. And I guarantee you, as you become a more thankful person, you'll become a more generous person. As you see God more clearly, as he becomes more beautiful to you, you're going to want to give yourself more to him.
Yeah. And it might just be that prayer of saying, I think Moses did it, like, Lord, show me your glory.
Yeah.
And just ask for that to be shown to you.
Yeah. And I mean, with all of this, of that outpouring, as we see in the passage, it's this attractive thing. Like when people are excited about God, when they're excited about what God is doing, and we share that. And as Derek just said, like for some people, this is just natural, and for others, it's a discipline. And it's okay if it's a discipline. I think for a lot of us, it's going to be a discipline where you have to say, like, I'm going to purposefully be generous, not just with my resources, but also with my time, and the way I'm even going to express this around other people, and drawing them into what God is doing in the church and in your life. All of that is going to get people way more excited, and they might see the same thing. Wow, if this person is so overwhelmed by the glory of God that they are going to get involved in this way, well, then maybe I want to be a part of that too. And I think that is a huge way that you can actually be an impact in the church through all of that, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes the verse, the God loves a joyful giver, kind of is echoing in my head right now. But does that mean that he doesn't love someone who gives begrudgingly? Like, let's balance that out. I mean,
I think it's not that he doesn't. It's not that he doesn't receive the gift that's given grudgingly, but this goes back to Darryl's main point, is that God most wants our hearts. So giving is part of the way that he draws our hearts to him. It's not just that giving is the response of hearts that are drawn towards him. Jesus himself says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So there is a reality that not only does our giving follow where our hearts are, but our heart follows what we give to. When you give your time to something, a great example, whenever my kids have got involved in activities, generally I have not given a rip about those activities before they have been involved in them. But all of a sudden, I'm investing my time, and my kids, who I care about, are invested in this. and my heart starts to move towards those things. I know as a parent of very active girls, like you've experienced that as well. So God wants our giving because our giving also draws our heart to him. But there is a sense in which he does love a gift that is given out of a heart that is not like, I'm doing this because you say I have to,
right,
or I'm doing this to try and earn something or get something from you. Right.
Yeah.
And I think with that, like, sometimes you start there, like you might not fully have that joy right to begin with. It might take a little bit of time. And again, that goes back to, don't feel like you have to nail all this stuff perfectly right out of the gate. Like you're just, the offering plate but goes by and you're like, praise the Lord, you're putting it in there. We don't even do offering plates, but so often I think in the church, they just kind of have this reputation that like the church or God is kind of after our stuff. And that's kind of what it's all about. And I've had that feedback talking with some people who've are either not Christians or have walked away from the church of feeling that. And that's something I just really want to press. And I think that's that verse in Corinthians that that Paul is pressing on, that, God is not just like after your stuff, like your resources, what you have. There is something far deeper to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, we often hear stories of people who get involved in the church for the very first time, and how that drastically shifts their relationship with Christ. And so when they get involved, the Bible becomes more alive to them because they get the picture that God is painting. And so that's always so exciting to watch. And but you got to start somewhere.
You have to start somewhere.
You have to start somewhere. Okay. We're coming to the end. There's some sad news that we have. Exodus finishes on Sunday.
Some exciting news too, though, Rachel, because the next series, even though I'm not going to get to preach a bunch of the weeks, I'm super excited about it.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited about it too. I'm always excited, but you have to end before you can move on. So there is joy and sorrow happening in these days. Yep. I'm really excited to see how they all weave together. But before we can move on to the next sermon series for the summer and then into our fall series, we have to finish Exodus. And so you're preaching on Sunday, Derek, but then you start your holidays, so you won't be joining on the podcast. I want to know what your biggest takeaway, greatest lesson you learned, something to kind of end the book of Exodus, maybe how it's transformed any part of your life throughout the past, how many weeks?
26.
26 weeks.
Half a year.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah. I think looking at the totality of the book, we actually cover quite a bit of time. We get a 400-year time jump at the very beginning, and then 80 years quite quickly in Moses' life. And I just looking at this and seeing how God is moving and working and doing all of these things behind the scenes. I think it's John Piper. I think I'm quoting John Piper when I say this. I think John Piper said, God is always doing 10,000 things at a time, of which you and I may be aware of 3 of them. And even just this past week, looking how God had provided the materials for the tabernacle a year earlier, God is working and moving, and we're very impatient people with very small time frames that we work in. And we start to really quickly, we're really like the people on at the bottom of the mountain. We're not sure what's happening for 40 days, and we start to freak out. And just this reminder that like God is at work. He's working out his plan. He's working out his purposes. He's guiding and directing things. And that has just really given me a sense of peace and calm, and increased my trust, even when sometimes the world seems like it is tearing itself apart at the seams.
Yeah, that's a great reminder for all of us to kind of sit in. Thank you for sharing that. And Darryl, you're up. You were not preaching on Sunday.
Nope.
We've got Greg preaching in Kitchener.
Yeah.
And that's going to be great. So he is going to wrap up the Exodus series there. So you won't have an opportunity next week either. So share with us your biggest takeaway, your biggest lesson learned, some sense of encouragement moving out of this book of Exodus.
Yeah. I won't be preaching this Sunday, but I'll be there, so I'll know how it ends, which is good. Won't leave me on a cliffhanger here.
It kind of does anyhow. We kind of just get left in the desert.
Yeah, we do.
So.
Yeah. I've so appreciated working through Exodus. Share with Derek this week of this is the longest series I've ever done preaching through. Usually my series have always been much, much shorter. So I didn't realize it was 26. I thought it was actually only 20, but I guess it's even longer than I thought. So that's been cool. What I've really appreciated in Exodus, a few things. So one is just how practical this series has been. When we first jumped into it, I really wondered, I'm like, how are we going to make all these connections from back then to today? And this is just one of those things, again, just amazed by the scriptures that we have, that even a book that was written so many years ago has so many application points to our lives, that we could really place ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites, that we could see ourselves making many of the same decisions and mistakes, and God can speak to us through his word. And so I've really appreciated that. I was surprised, again, going through Exodus, of how many of these big moments that I think culturally we know a lot of in Christianity is tied up in the book of Exodus as well. So it's been a well-known book for many of us for different reasons. But the biggest thing I've seen is how Moses, for the people, really with Christ 2,000 years later, or several thousand years later, he was the true and better version of Moses. That Moses was always interceding on the people's behalf. He was leading the people. He was doing all of these things does it well, but imperfectly. But then through Christ, we see this better picture. We see what Moses was always pointing towards, that in Christ we have the one who intercedes for us. That when we are seeking after the face of God, that we actually just look to Christ, that when we see him, that we are looking at the Father. And so in so many ways, Jesus shows up really naturally throughout the pages of Exodus. And I've really appreciated that, and hopefully for the listeners, for those in our church, that they have seen that direct connection to the Gospels as well.
Yeah, that's so great. It was a beautiful picture. I loved walking through it, but I love the Old Testament. And so it's been a really great 26 weeks. Super excited though. Moving forward, we're going into Philippians 4:8.
Yep.
So it's going to be very different.
We're going to spend 5 weeks in one verse.
Yeah.
Sort of. It's going to be the jumping off point.
Yeah. But
for us to look at some filtering of our thoughts.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to then lead us into our fall series. So we're going to Acts. I think you've already announced that. Mm-hmm. So we're just doing this. And I just want to encourage the listeners today to just keep in mind that God is at work through the scriptures, through the Old Testament into the New Testament, into our lives now. And there is this beautiful thread that weaves through all the sermons that we have done it. And I just want to encourage you to kind of be aware of that and see if you can just watch how God is moving through each of these passages that we study through. So with that, thank you both for spending time going deeper into being generous and generous hearts and hands. Thanks, listeners, for being with us. Tune in next week where we will finish out the Exodus series.
Just you and Pastor Greg.
Just me and Pastor Greg. Yeah. It's going to be great. Can't wait for that. It's going to be a great day. So again, thanks, listeners. We will see you, or you'll hear us next week.